Dear students, welcome to biology class. I am your biology teacher Sidra Rubab, and today I am going to teach you movement into and out of cells, diffusion and osmosis. Here are the contents of today's lecture. You should know the role of the water as a solvent in organisms with reference to digestion, excretion and transport. Understand that energy for diffusion and osmosis comes from the kinetic energy of random movement of the molecules and ions. Understand diffusion as the net movement of molecules or ions from a region of their higher concentration to a region of their lower concentration, and investigate the factors that influence diffusion limited to surface area, temperature, concentration, gradient, and distance. First of all, you should know what are solutions. A solution is a type of mixture where one substance is dissolved into another. So here are two main components of solution. Number one, solute, and number two, solvent. Solute is a substance that is being dissolved by another substance. For example, salts, sugar. And the solvent is the substance in which the solute will dissolve. This is called a solvent. For example, water is a solvent that dissolves sugar. In a sugar water solution, sugar is the solute and water is the solvent, like this. In this diagram, the water is acting as a solvent and a sugar is being dissolved in that solvent. So the sugar is termed as solute and the water is termed as solvent. Here are three main types of the solutions depending upon the concentration of the solute in the solvent. Hypotonic solutions. Hypotonic solutions are such solutions which we call as these are dilute solutions, because in such solutions there is little amount of solute in the solvent. The concentration of the solvent is greater and the amount of the solute is smaller. While in hypertonic solutions, the solute concentration is greater. Hyper mean greater, more. Hypertonic solutions are more concentrated solutions because such solutions are having lesser amount of the solvent and greater amount of the solute. And iso means same, and isotonic solutions are such solutions in which the solute and solvent concentration is equivalent to each other. So what happened when an animal cell is placed inside a hypotonic solution? When an animal cell is placed in a hypotonic solution, it means the solution is having higher concentration of the water and the water concentration of the cell is lesser. That's why water tend to move from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. In this case, the cell become turgid and one state comes that the cell ruptures because of the influx of the water. In isotonic solution, there is no net gain or net loss of the water and the cell becomes normal in its shape. While in hypertonic solution, when the cell is placed in a hypertonic solution, like this solution, which is having larger amount of the solute concentration, in this case, the water from the cell moves outside this hypertonic solution and the cell shrinks. While in case of the plants, there are some differences in animal and plant cell when they placed in hypertonic, hypo or isotonic situations. Isotonic situation remains same for both animal and plant cell. While in hypertonic situation, the plant cell, we call that plant cell is not ruptured because it is having an outermost covering which is rigid most covering, and this tough and rigid covering we call that this is cell wall. And because of the presence of the cell wall, the plant cell doesn't uh, uh, the plant cell maintains its shape, and when water move outside the cell, the plant's cell shape is maintained and we call that this plant cell is plasmolysed. While when the cell is placed in a hypotonic solution, in this case, The water will moves from outer environment because outer environment is hypotonic, and the hypotonic environment is having more concentration of solvent and lesser concentration of solute. It means it is having more amount of the water, and that's why the water will move from outer environment to inside the cell, and the vacuole will filled with water, and the plant cell becomes turgid. What is the role of the water as a solvent? Water is universal solvent. A liquid in which substance is dissolved. Polarity attracts charged particles into a solution that dissolves proteins, glucose, some minerals, which is important for digestion. Water also helps the transport of dissolved nutrients and other substances throughout the body. It transports oxygen, nutrients, hormones to the cells. And it also transports waste products away from the cell for the excretion in the urine and in stool. During digestion, water plays very important role because it hydrolyzes the bonds of three important organic compounds such as carbohydrates, proteins, and fat molecules, and the digestion requires the breakdown of these three important organic compounds. Water is formed and released when smaller molecules join together during condensation. Here we come to the point which is transport of substances. There are two main types of the transport. Number one, passive transport mechanism, and number two, active transport mechanism. The passive transport mechanism is such mechanism in which no respiratory energy is required, while in active transport mechanism, respiratory energy is required for the transportation of the materials or substances across the cell. The passive transport mechanisms are of two kinds, diffusion and osmosis. And one more thing is a facilitated diffusion, which I am not going to discuss today. So, diffusion is the movement of molecules or ions down the concentration gradient, while the osmosis is the movement of the water molecules, or we can say that movement of the solvent. Especially osmosis is the movement of the water molecules from a solution of higher water concentration or higher water potential to a solution of lower water concentration or lower water potential across a partially permeable membrane. So here are similarities in the diffusion and osmosis and some differences in diffusion and osmosis. The similarities are the both processes are passive processes because in both situations no respiratory energy is required. And the second similarity is that the movement of the substances is down the concentration gradient, while the differences include that osmosis refers only to water molecules. In osmosis, the transportation of the water molecule occurs, while in diffusion, any substance, any ion can move. The second difference is that in osmosis, partially permeable membrane is required, while in diffusion, membrane is not required. So diffusion, it is the movement of all the types of the molecules from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration, and such as along the concentration gradient, or you can say that down the concentration gradient. This process doesn't require energy. Presence of the membrane may or may not be involved. It is also called as passive transport. In this you can see that in this apparatus here is more water concentration, and sorry, in this situation here is lesser solute concentration and more water concentration. That's why water may move from its higher concentration to lower concentration. This is called as diffusion. You can see that what is the meaning of the concentration gradient in diffusion, which is a passive transport, diffusion or osmosis in both the cases, because both of these are passive transport mechanisms. In both situations, here is mentioned a higher concentration and here are lower concentration. So molecules will tend to move from their higher to lower concentration down the concentration gradient or along the concentration gradient. Concentration gradient means that the difference between the concentration. It means that in one place the concentration of the substance is higher, and in the other place the concentration of the substance is lower. That's why we're calling it as a concentration gradient. So in diffusion, molecules move down the concentration gradient like this. So where the energy for the diffusion comes in liquid and gaseous molecules, they possess kinetic energy and are continuously moving about. So the kinetic energy of moving molecules provide the energy for diffusion. Respiratory energy is not required in diffusion. The only energy which is required for the diffusion, this energy comes from the transporting or the moving molecules that possess their special kinetic energy. So the kinetic energy is the main force or main energy for diffusion. An equilibrium is reached when molecules are evenly spaced out, and it is not that the molecules have stopped moving. In fact, they are always moving about, but there is same number of them everywhere because there is no net gain or net loss of the substances. There is no net movement of the substances. In such situation, in such case, this system is maintaining the dynamic equilibrium. So when dynamic equilibrium is maintained, then there is no net transport of the material. Which factors affect the rate of the diffusion? Number one, concentration gradient. The steeper the concentration gradient, the faster the rate of the diffusion is. The distance. Farther the distance between the two systems from where the diffusion is taking place, the slower the rate of the diffusion. Number three, temperature. Heat causes particles to gain kinetic energy and move faster. The higher the temperature, the more is the kinetic energy and the faster is the rate of diffusion. Surface area. The larger the surface area, the greater is the diffusion. Number two, osmosis. Osmosis is the movement of water molecules from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. In osmosis, diffusion of the water takes place, and the requirement is membrane, which is in most of the cases selectively permeable membrane. Here are two types of osmosis: endosmosis and exosmosis. In endosmosis, water moves in the cell across the membrane, while in exosmosis, water moves out from the cell membrane. Here is a system in which the separation is with the help of a partially permeable membrane. This is a membrane which is porous. It means that it is partially permeable membrane. Partially or selectively permeable membrane means that it allows only few substances to cross through it, and it acts as a barrier for some other substances. So in this system, in this side, which is left side, the left side is having a concentrated solution. It means that here is a larger number of the sugar molecules. It means that it is hypertonic solution, while the right side is dilute sugar solution. It means that here is lesser concentration of the sugar. It means that it is hypotonic solution. So the concentration of the water is more in left side and lesser in the right side. That's why the water will tend to move from its higher concentration to lower concentration along the concentration gradient, or you can say it down the concentration gradient. The steeper the concentration gradient is, steeper means that when there is more difference, there is a difference between the concentration gradient. It means that when there is more difference, that the concentrated sugar solution, if it is having 80% sugars and the dilute solution is having only 10%, that it means there is a huge difference. So when there is huge difference, we can say that this is the steeper concentration gradient. In a steeper concentration gradient, the movement of the water from an area of higher concentration to lower concentration is faster. And when the movement of the water is through permeable membrane, then this is osmosis. And you can see that here an equilibrium is maintained at this situation when in both of the sides are having equal amount of the water and sugars. Then there is no net transport of the material between two parts, and we can say that dynamic equilibrium is maintained. Here is another example. This is a tube whose right side again it is having only 5% sucrose and 95% is water, and in the left side 10% sucrose is present and 90% water is. So the water will tend to move from this partial permeable or selectively permeable membrane along the concentration gradient like this. Active transport. Active transport is the movement of the molecules or ions from an area of lower concentration to an area of higher concentration. This is opposite to the passive transport mechanism, because in this mechanism respiratory energy is required in the movement of the substances, which are solutes or ions, against the concentration gradient. In these situations, molecules move against the concentration gradient. Here is the diagram of a partially permeable membrane. Here are some protein channels, and this membrane, you can say that outside the membrane there is a greater concentration of a substance, and inside the membrane at this side there is lower concentration of this material. And when the substances tend to move from their lower concentration to higher concentration, they will move with the help of energy which is respiratory energy. Their kinetic energy is not enough to transport them from their lower concentration to higher concentration. So when their movement is across the concentration gradient, then they doesn't require respiratory energy. But in case when the movement of the material or the substances is against the concentration gradient against means that from lower concentration to higher concentration, then the respiratory energy will be required to transport these materials across the membrane. Here is a diagrammatic representation of the concentration gradient. It is in this situation, here is the higher concentration and lower concentration. When the molecules, and here is a molecule, when this molecule is moving against the concentration gradient, it means that it is moving from downward to top like this. Then the this is the active transport mechanism, and it requires respiratory energy. So students, it's all about today's lecture. Note these slides carefully and learn all the topics that I taught you today.